Welcome in to David L. Gray off code and unscripted on Saint Dominic's Media. That's saintdominicsmedia.com. Visit us there for more content, more videos, more essays, more theology courses, more podcasts, reflections. Find out about us there. Visit us there. We have a lot to offer. I hope you like it. And come on over. That's saintdominicsmedia.com. And we are drinking what I'm drinking tonight is a Uncle Near's 1884 whiskey. I'm drinking it neat, of course. There's argument to be made about from people. You want to drink your whiskey or your bourbon with an ice cube because the ice, adds a little bit of flavor, brings out some of the more flavors of the alcohol. I tend to like mine neat though, because oftentimes I'll drink it slow, and by the time I get done, the ice cube is melted and the bourbon is pretty much just all watered down. But here's Uncle Nearest. I'm not a big whiskey drinker. I'm pretty much all bourbon, but I initially bought Uncle Nearest because of the story. Really neat story. His name is Nathan Nearest Green, and he actually taught Jack Daniels the art of whiskey distillation. And his story went unnoticed, unheard for about 150 years. Because a lot of people at that time, and typically Black Americans, they were involved in a lot of the arts and even music, and oftentimes didn't get credit for the things that they did. Oftentimes their ideas were stolen. And so I bought this because of the story. I wasn't a whiskey drinker at all back then. Pretty much stayed away from whiskey, but I drank it and I loved it. It's on a sweeter end, but not too sweet. But it doesn't have a sharp bite. It leaves a really good aftertaste in your mouth. So if you are a whiskey fan, make sure you check out. I definitely recommend Uncle Nearest. So I initially heard about it when I was living in St. Louis. Then I was in Cleveland, and I found it there at the store. A lot of people weren't buying it back then. Were selling it back then. So I found it, bought it, and been buying it ever since. And even now, I can get it here in Germany. So it's really caught on, and it's really the only whiskey that I'll buy. So that's what we're drinking tonight. Uncle Nearest. Cheers. So what are we talking about today? Well, in the last one, I was breaking down one of those sophistic arguments that you hear from rad trading and sedevacantists. One of the arguments they tend to make against the Novus Ordo, promoting their liturgy wars, is that the Novus Ordo Mass, the ordinary form of Mass that we had today, is bad Mass, is a near occasion of sin, it's not efficacious, that it has a shady history because it was started by Freemasons and Protestants, right? And one of the people that they like to pull out was a guy named Annabelle Benini, who was a Freemason, who in my book, The Catholic Catechism on Freemasonry, is really the only book you can buy that actually shows the lodge Annabelle Benini belonged to, his membership number, his membership code name in the P2 Lodge. So I actually put out the documentation that he is a Freemason, not based upon any sort of myths or any sort of stories or some sort of fiction, but no, actual documentation. I did the work. But so he's a Freemason, but then they take that logical leap that because he's a Freemason and because he's involved in the formulation of the new Mass post Vatican II, that therefore the Mass is some sort of Freemason ritual, which is again it's a logical leap that's not based upon facts, it's based upon motion, and that's really all the arguments that you hear from rad trading instead of a contest. Arguments based upon emotion, not facts. It's emotions over facts. But what I did in the last one, off code unscripted on this subject, I break that down, show how the whole thing was silly. That no, Annabelle he had very little to offer, almost nothing to offer with the ordinary form of the Mass that we had today, so called the Novus Ordo. Rather, the fact of the matter is that the liturgical reform started close to 100 years before the Second Vatican Council was even convoked. And that one of the people who was probably more influential, and by the way, the liturgical reforms, they included everything that you see in the order in the Novus Ordo today. This so-called more participation of the people, the priest facing the people. It's not so much here. Some people talking about that, but not so much. But really, the participation of the people, the Mass in the vernacular, a simpler, shorter Mass. You see all these elements people are talking about for 100 years, even before Vatican II. But one of the people I think was really more influential, I talked about in the video, was a guy named by a priest by the name of Pius Parch. He was here in Germany, and he started a mass during the Church of Reforms that was called the People's Mass. And the People's Mass, it emphasized, it's pretty much the Novus Ordo, pretty much the Novus Ordo that you see today. It had a freestanding altar, had a priest facing the people. The mass was in German, meaning the mass is in the vernacular. They revived the offertory rite that comes from the very early church, where the people present the gifts for the sacrifice. So the readings and the prayers were in the vernacular, and he was emphasizing liturgical seasons over the calendar of saints. So that's really your father, one of your main fathers of the Novus Ordo Mass. So not Annibale Bernini. Annibale would have known the Pius Parch. Perhaps he would have traveled to his parish here in Germany and seen how this thing looks. But yeah, so the whole thing is really just a hoax, a myth that's propagated by Radtrad Inc. and set of a contest to get your emotions going over the facts themselves. So I refute that in that video. And now I want to touch on another myth that you hear from rad trading instead of a contest about this topic. And let's continue this conversation where we talk about facts over feelings, right? Because I think this is an important topic, because a lot of people they would like to really destroy your faith, um and they would like to drive you away from the church. They like you to ask questions that will eventually cause you to either eventually become a son of a contest yourself, or just leave the church, end up like them, right? And they tend to be people who do not trust Jesus Christ with his church. They like to take matters into their own hands, right? And say that it's on them to fix Jesus church, and this is how they're going to fix it, by falling into this era of Protestantism, by promoting division, right? So one of their other arguments they like to present, um besides the one with the Freemasons and the Protestants started a mass, they like to say that, well, the Novus Ordo Mass is less efficacious, and it's not a good mass. It's not really true worship. It's a near occasion of sin. It's an offense to God, because the Novus Ordo Mass does not mention the word sacrifice as many times as the Latin Mass, whatever you want to call it, traditional Latin Mass, the Reform, the ancient Reform, Roman rites, whatever you want to call it, the Roman Canon of 1962, whatever you want to call it, you know what I'm talking about. They would say that the the prayers of consecration in the older rites, the Latin rites, says, because it says the word sacrifice during prayers of consecration more often than the Novus Ordo, then it's a higher form of worship. It's true worship. It's a true sacrifice taking place. It's evident what is taking place there at the altars, a sacrifice, because the word sacrifice is actually being said. In fact, check out this argument here. This is a priest here who is a Father Dave Nix, who is Radtrad Inc. Listen to the arguments he makes in this video, and then I'll come back and we'll do some facts over feeling. This is David O'Gray Show, Off Code, Unscripted, St. Dominic's Media.
Father Charles Murr, who's on your podcast, I believe, weekly, he goes very deep into the fact that Freemasons had infiltrated the Catholic Church. Most of your listeners, if they're watching Father Murr, they know his story with Cardinal Gagnon and everything. When the Fathers of Vatican II admitted they brought in Protestants to have nothing in the new Mass that's offensive to them, the number one thing they had to take out was reference to sacrifice. See, they were okay a little bit with a reference to Christ's presence in the Eucharist. The ultra liberals pushed against that and wanted only to have something of a president over a meal. They knew they couldn't push that far, so they kept language of the true presence of Christ, but what they extricated was all reference to sacrifice. The three parts of Old Testament and New Testament sacrifice is the offertory, the slaying, and the consummation. And what you'll notice in a lot of the propers of the Novus Ordo Mass, especially in the offertory, is the extrication or the removal of all aspects of sacrifice. In other words, we know that the Holy Mass is the representation of the very sacrifice of Calvary. Jesus Christ on the cross. I always say to people, when you attend Mass, pretend like you're in a time machine going back to Calvary. You're arm in arm with the Blessed Virgin Mary, watching Jesus be crucified. It is the exact same sacrifice. Now, there are good conservative Novus Ordo priests that will definitely admit that it is sacrifice. But it's a big problem in my eyes that the people that wrote the new propers and even the new Eucharistic prayers took the word sacrifice out as much as they could.
Now, I should say I'm a huge fan of all liturgies. If you ever read my book, the Divine Symphony and the Scordium on the Theology of the Catholic Mass, you'll see in that book I speak about all of the liturgies that are presently still being exemplified, worked, celebrated in the Catholic Church today. I'm a big fan of liturgy because I think one of the problems that people, what doesn't help these liturgy wars is oftentimes we tend to think about liturgy as a what, sometimes even as a where. But a proper way to think about liturgy is not by a what or a where, but rather liturgy is a who. Liturgy is a who, because at the liturgy we encounter a who named Jesus Christ, right? So Jesus Christ is the essence of the Mass. He is truly the essence of the liturgy in the Mass. So liturgy we encounter a who, Jesus Christ. Liturgy is not a what. So, but let's look at this by the numbers and really analyze this argument that people like Father David Nix is presenting. So, by the numbers, Father David Nix is correct. The what we call the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, 1962, the traditional land mass. Yes, it does have, I think, 6 times in the prayers of consecration that the word sacrifice is said by the priest. 6. That's compared to Eucharistic prayer number 1 of the ordinary form, the Novus Ordo, which says it 4 times. So we go from, there's a reduction here from 6 to 4. All right. But let's not use the word reduction. Okay. Because I think one of the errors of Radtrad Inc. instead of a contest is that they like to compare the traditional Latin Mass, they like to compare the extraordinary form to the ordinary form. I think that's completely ignorant. Because if you read the documents of the Reform movement, they are not trying to give birth to a new liturgy out of the traditional Latin Mass. They're not trying to say that it is even related or that it's a some sort of related replacement. Rather, it's a completely new thing. It's a new expression of the encounter with the who, right? It's a new form. The essence doesn't change. The essence is still a who is Jesus Christ, but there's a new form. There's a new escalator that we're being conveyed up or through or around, whatever, however you want to use the term escalator. It's a new vehicle, new mechanism, new delivery method. Okay. So we should stop trying to compare the two. I compare this liturgy war when people try to do this as a comparison between the extraordinary form and ordinary form is someone who married a woman and always comparing that woman to their mom. Right? Oh, you don't cook food like my mom. My mom's food is better than yours. My mom does this better. She irons my clothes better. She washes better, right? And so and so just imagine a wife always having to hear this, and right, this is people who go to the worship at the Novus Order now. They're always having to hear somebody compare this to their mom, right, and try to make a shipwreck of their faith and try to make them feel like they're less of a Catholic or their faith isn't good enough because you're comparing us to something else, right? And so good wife would would tell the guy, well, go eat at your mom's house. Go have sex with your mom, right? That's what a wife will eventually get to, right? Who do you want, me or your mom? But that's what's really going on. So it's a bad thing to do. So even though there's a reduction of 2 when it comes to the 1962 Missal and Eucharistic Prayer number 1 in Novus Ordo, we shouldn't even think about it that way, all right? Because they're not even trying to do the same. They're not related in that way, okay? But yeah, I think the arguments does even look more clear if we want to continue that line of attack. Once we get to Eucharistic prayers number 2, 3, and 4, we don't hear the word sacrifice at all in the Novus Ordo. Is that a problem? Well, we should think about it a little more before we get to that therefore, right? And try to make that logical leap. That because Eucharistic prayers 2, 3, 4 don't say the word sacrifice at all, then therefore it's not a true sacrifice. Therefore, it's a not an efficacious mass. Therefore, all these things you get to. Therefore, I think is illogical. But let's take a look at some, let's continue by the numbers. Let's take a look at the Eastern Rite, my preference, the Byzantine Mass. So let's take a look at some of the versions of their prayers of consecration, such as the Divine Liturgy of St. Gregory. Oh, and by the way, here's if you visit stdomixmedia.com, here's a wonderful book you can buy by Dr. Nicholas Newman. We are so proud to publish this book. It is the Liturgy of St. Gregory the Theologian. So this book is probably one of the most well documented books on the ancient liturgy of St. Gregory the Theologian. A lot of people buy this book at St. Dominic's Media, as a lot of universities use it as the textbook of choice when it comes to this subject. But in the Divine Liturgy is St. Gregory the Theologian, how many times is the word sacrifice used in the prayers of consecration? Well, the same number as Eucharistic prayer number 1 in Novus Ordo, 4 times. Okay, and no one ever would ever say that the Divine Liturgy of Saint Gregory Theologian is some sort of deficient liturgy, or it's not true worship, or that it's a near occasion of sin, simply because it uses the word sacrifice in the prayers of consecration 4 times, right? And then let's take a look at the Divine Liturgy of Saint Basil the Great in the liturgy of prayers of consecration. There, the word sacrifice, yes, is used 10 to 12 times, depending upon the season. So that's about double the times as the 1962 missal. Does that mean that the 1962 missal is deficient? That it's a near occasion of sin? That it's not true worship because it's the prayers, the word sacrifice said half the time? No one would ever say that. Let's take a look at the Divine Liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom, where the word sacrifice in the prayers of consecration is said 6 to 8 times. So again, equal or more than the 1962 missal. All right, so that's just by the numbers. So by the numbers, we really only see one problem with the Novus Ordo. That's in prayers, Eucharistic prayers 2, 3, and 4. But let's talk about that a little further. So yes, by the numbers, it seems to be fewer, but does fewer actually matter, right? Does the amount of repetition of a times of the amount of times that thing is said, does that really matter, right? Because I think that's you have to argue this case before you get to that therefore, right? If you're going to say, well, because the prayers in the Novus Ordo, let's say Eucharistic prayers 2, 3, and 4 do not say the word sacrifice, then therefore there's something wrong with those prayers of consecration. Well, first you have to get to the point, you have to make the case that repetition matters, right? So let's go there. Let's talk about repetition, right? So I would argue that the amount of repetition is not what makes a thing true or even more efficacious or less efficacious, right? And I would argue that because I would say that, well, if you were to tell a lie, right? If you were to tell a lie, you'll say, well, it's raining outside now, right? And if I were to tell a lie, go tell my wife, it's not actually raining. Actually, it's sunny and 80 degrees. And it's not actually nighttime. It's 3 in the morning. If I were to say that over and over again, let's say 6 times, right? Does that make it true? If I were to say it 1 time, does it make it true? If I say it 2 times, does that make it true? If I were to say it 20 times, does that make it true? No. So repetition does not make a thing true. Lies can be said over and over again. If you listen to the news, especially you listen to Democrats, I would say nowadays, especially, listen to the news. Um, you listen to these politicians. No, they lie all the time. It doesn't mean what they say is true. So repetition does not necessarily make a thing true or more efficacious or more valid or more trustworthy, right? And second, I would argue against that point. I would say, well, things are true even if we cannot see them or hear them. Imagine a deaf person at mass. They're deaf. And so because they cannot hear the word sacrifice being said 6 times, 4 times, 12 times, does that mean that it is still a sacrifice? Yes, it does mean that it's still a sacrifice, whether they don't hear the words or they do not hear the words. So repetition in this case doesn't matter at all because the words may not be heard. But even if the words are not heard, they're still true or they're still false. So there has to be something deeper than words here that makes a thing true or false. Right? Next, I would argue this. I would say things are true not because we say they are. Right? It has to be something deeper than words. So I would say things are true. Things can be true not because we say they are, but because they are. Things are true because God is truth. So whatever is true comes from God, such as a sacrifice, right? So imagine I don't know, I'm drinking whiskey. Okay. And I really don't have to say that I am. Now, of course, these can be multiple things. It doesn't necessarily have to be whiskey. It could be cognac. It could be a dark wine, perhaps. It could be bourbon. Right. But imagine if the option is only whiskey. Um, I really don't have to tell you what I'm doing. We don't even have to say what liquid. We could just say drinking. I don't have to tell you what I'm doing for you to know what I'm doing. Because things would be true without words. Right. Or pick out something more obvious. I don't know, to the senses. Say if I'm eating an orange, you know that I'm eating an orange and not an apple because I am. Right? So things are true not because of human words, but because of human actions. So we can oftentimes know a thing by its fruit, by its actions. This is just a simple scientific method used by, I don't know, Aristotle, one of the early scientists, right? He said if he observed a thing long enough, that thing will tell you what it is. It is just by observation. So sometimes observation, just observing the things, observing its actions, tell you what they are. But the important thing about actions is that actions and words, the relationship is that words should match actions so that there's no duplicity. So when there's a set of words and there's actions that are contradictory to one another, it's always a problem. And it makes our words worth nothing if our actions do not match them, right? So the sacrifice of the Mass is true, not because of our words, but because of Christ Jesus' actions and words, which match each other. So the sacrifice of the Mass is true because of Jesus' actions and his words at his prayers of consecration, which I think he mentioned as sacrifice. What in Luke, what he mentions it, I want to say 2 times. So definitely fewer times than the extraordinary for the Mass, right? So we don't go back and ask Jesus, why didn't you say the word sacrifice 8 times, 6 times? No, right? So yeah, I think there's a problem here, right? It's really one of the worst arguments you can really hear. So like I said, I'm a huge fan of traditional at Mass. I'm not a fan of l- lazy lazy arguments or weak arguments, right? Like I really want to be on board with with promoting the traditional Latin Mass and allowing more people to experience and worship through it. Right here in Germany, I would have to travel about 45 minutes to go to FSSP if I want to worship traditional Latin Mass every Sunday. Right? And I know people who do that from base. If I want to worship at the traditional Latin Mass on Sundays, well, I just have to travel about maybe 10 minutes to a couple towns over, on first Sundays of the month. So even here in Germany, I like more people to experience it, but I don't want to like guilt people into experiencing a liturgy, especially with these like really weak arguments that make no sense whatsoever. But one point I would also say about the silliness of the liturgy wars and how they undermine the people themselves, and how it makes the whole community look really silly, and I would bring up James, chapter 2, verse 18, where James says it's about faith and works, and James says, "You have faith, and I have works. Demonstrate your faith to me without works, and I will demonstrate my faith to you from my works." So James is saying that, oh, you saying you have faith alone? Okay. But you don't have works? Well, watch me. Watch my works become animated through my faith. So he sees the relationship between words and actions, right? What I'm trying to communicate here. And I think that same argument can be used with people of any liturgy. What are you promoting? What liturgy war? What are you doing in liturgy wars? Are you promoting the efficacy of the Novus Ordo, efficacy of the traditional Latin Mass? What are you doing? What are you saying? And I would really say the same thing in this argument. Like, show me your sacrifice. Right? You say your liturgy has. You say you mention the word sacrifice all these times. Okay, well, show me your sacrifice with your life. Show me your sacrifice with your life. And and and, and with all those times that the word sacrifice is mentioned in your liturgy, well, show it to me. Show it to me with your life, and I will show you my sacrifice without hearing those words as many times. Right? And I think that's a true Catholic response, because the sacrifice belongs to Jesus Christ. Those words are His. That action was His. And the only thing that we're doing is that we're participating in that sacrifice through the body of Christ. So we are a sacrificial people. We are a liturgical people. And we are those people with or without hearing those words during the prayers of consecration, outside of His actual words that we must hear during the prayers of consecration, because those are His words. But even like I said, a deaf person who doesn't hear those words, he still lives a liturgical life. He still lives a sacrificial life. He still lives the good Samaritan if he's truly in the body of Christ and his life is being animated by the Holy Spirit. He's going to be a sacrificial person. So our response to those people, like, well, show me your sacrifice. You're saying your liturgy has mentioned sacrifice this many times. Well, show me your sacrifice, and I'll show you my sacrifice without hearing those words as many times, if that's the case, right? But my final point, I would like to return to the argument just by the numbers, just by the numbers. One thing that really struck me about um the Eastern liturgies, what really caused me to fall in love with them, was um just hearing the word sin, especially in the Byzantine liturgy. Not probably not so much the Melchi, but I know it's in the Byzantine liturgy, divine liturgy, that the word sin is mentioned so many times, so many times. And um it depending upon what version is being used, some versions have a heck of a lot more than others. But I think it's Basil, maybe. Um, I think his liturgy, I think sin is mentioned, man, maybe 30 something times, right? Sin or sinful, some variation. You kind of leave that mass, that liturgy, knowing, man, I'm in bad shape. I'm a sinner, but they just have more prayers of non-sacramental prayers of absolution during that liturgy, right? So you just know you just know your condition. You know how sick you are in that liturgy, and you know that you're there for healing, and that, man, this place is medicinal. This is chronic care. I'm getting some treatment here, just because how many times the word sin and sinful is mentioned. Now, once we get to the Western liturgies, it's not even close. Sinful is mentioned maybe 6 times, 4 times is really low. Like, you really don't know you're a sinner in the Western liturgies. You just don't. If we're going by repetition, if repetition matters. If we're saying that's the argument, oh, repetition matters. That's because you mention a thing this time or that thing, this many times, then it's therefore more efficacious. It's more powerful. Something is really happening because of the propensity, the number of times that you're mentioning something. Well, sin is not really mentioned much at all in the Western liturgies as compared to the Eastern. So therefore, the Western liturgies are trash. They're not really healing people. They're not talking about sin, right? But there we also use the same argument. Somebody's making a case. Well, show me your life without sin. Your liturgy mentions sin as many times. Well, show me your life without sin, and I'll show you my life without sin being mentioned that many times. So we apply the same argument, right? So no, yeah, I find the Eastern liturgies, definitely myself. This is my personal opinion, to be of higher quality of the Western liturgies because of all the prayers of intercession, because of our sins. It's why I prefer the Eastern liturgies over the Western. But if I live a holy life, that's the best evidence of the liturgy that I prefer. The best evidence of the liturgy that you prefer is not your words, but your actions. So I would say liturgy wars are really dumb, right? Because they use too many words. If you want to win the liturgy wars, I would say to the people of the traditional Latin Mass, if you want to win the liturgy wars, be a saint, like die as a holy person, and then we can look back on your life and say, oh, why are they different than everyone else? Then one thing we would look at it was the liturgy that you tend to go to, that you tend to prefer, and we say, oh, whoa. The mass that he always went to was from the 1962 Missal, or the mass that he went to was this or that. Oh, there must be something there. So I would say let your life be the evidence of the liturgy that you prefer. I would say live a sacrificial life, live a liturgical life, and that way you can prove that your liturgy means something, right? That those words that are said during the liturgy, whether it's sin a bunch of times or sacrifice a bunch of times, that those words had power to animate your life. That you were in a world who the liturgy formed you to be. I would say that's the best evidence. And so, yeah, so the liturgy wars use too many words. Um, but I would say if you want to promote the liturgy wars and win the liturgy wars, let it be with your life, not your words. This is David O. Gray Show, off code, unscripted, on St. Dominic's Media. I'll see you in the next one. But until then, until next time, blessings and shalom to you and to yours. Cheers.